Audible is my road trip companion.
It's kind of my quiet alone time.
Audible is a routine for me.
It's like a fun night school for adults.
I could easily be seduced into locking myself in a place where I do nothing but listen to books.
I never was interested in historical fiction before, but I'm obsessed with it now.
There are a lot of classic and big titles that I feel like I missed out. Since I don't have time to read, might as well listen.
If I want to catch up on the news or history or learn what's going on in the world, I can download a book and listen to it.
Because I listened to her story over and over again, I made the decision to go ahead and follow my own dream, which was to help other veterans.
I think there's like 180 books in my library now. It changes your perspective. It makes you a different person. It's true. It's so true.
Download Audible and start listening today.
Hello and welcome. I'm Kimbriell Kelly, the Washington Bureau Chief at the LA Times. Welcome to the 25th annual LA Times Festival of Books. Well, at least to our virtual event. Today we're going to have a great discussion on the economy titled, What's Next? The State of the American Economy. And joining us for our discussion are Mehrsa Baradaran. She's a UC Irvine professor whose work covers banking law, financial inclusion, and inequality. She's written a book called The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. We also have Sarah Chayes, internationally recognized for her innovative thinking on corruption and its implications. Her new book is titled On Corruption in America. And then finally, we have Jennifer Taub, a professor at the Western New England University School of Law and advocate whose writings focus on following the money. Her new book is titled Big Dirty Money. Before we get into the conversation, I want to remind everyone to support your local independent bookstores during this festival. Pages, a bookstore, is the seller for this event, and they have signed book plates available with your book purchase. Mehrsa, Sarah, and Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you.
So I was trying to figure out, based off of your books, a thread that flowed between all of the books. And as I thought over the last few months, I'm like, gosh, well, it's about the economy, but it's about more than that. It's about people who are disenfranchised. It's about access to capital. And then the election happened. And I said, oh, we're going to have plenty to talk about as it relates to your books in terms of corruption and everything else. So I'm excited about the conversation that we're going to have today. So let's get started and jump right in. So Sarah, let's start with you. You've written a lot about corruption, and your book and all of its discussion on the history of corruption is, shall we say, relevant this year. And so tell us exactly what it was that was the catalyst for your book.
I have been working on it for years. I got into it, believe it or not, in Afghanistan. I had no intention, but it was Afghans who came to me saying, if you Americans don't tackle the corruption of this government, it doesn't matter how many soldiers you send in here. And they were telling me, the Taliban shake us down at night, but the government shakes us down in the daytime. So how do you expect us to take risks on behalf of a government that treats us just as badly as the Taliban does or do? And so that's when I realized that corruption is actually at the root of a lot of in that case, it was religious extremism. It really went back to corruption. And then I took that thesis to various other developing countries, including Arab Spring countries, including Central Asia, and later in Latin America, in Nepal, on, half a dozen continents. And I found a very similar story. And so in 2016, and even before that, my last book, Thieves of State, which won the LA Times Book Prize, I'm very honored to say, did end with a chapter saying, hey guys, this ain't just those folks over there. We, the United States, are on this continuum. And so I knew that at some point I would have to grapple with this. I didn't realize how quickly. In 2016 came, even before the election, the Supreme Court ruling in a corruption case to do with the former then governor of Virginia. convicted of corruption, upheld on appeal unanimously. Blew my mind that the Supreme Court overturned that conviction unanimously. And I said, wow, there's a huge split between what ordinary Americans understand corruption to mean and what these elites across the political spectrum understand it to mean. And that really was the moment. In fact, the opinion basically said the American democracy has more to fear from the fight against corruption than it does from corruption itself. And I thought, we're in for trouble.
But do you feel that the corruption that's happening in our country now, that people are really viewing that as the corruption that you saw happening in Afghanistan? Like, it's
Absolutely.
not that bad.
Absolutely. I actually think ordinary Americans respond almost identically to the way that Nigerians or Afghans did. And they know corruption when they see it. They don't necessarily adhere to the sort of mincing legal definitions of corruption, which in fact have been narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed by a campaign really over the last 20 or 30 years. And so I think it's not as in your face as it is in a place like Afghanistan where police officers are shaking you down on every street corner. But I really think that one of the reasons so many Americans don't vote, and even in this last election where we had record turnout, it's not like 80% of the electorate or anything like that. I think there's a real sense that, the parties on these fundamental issues of how the political economy is bent deliberately by people that you can name to serve their networks, their kind of integrated networks. Ordinary Americans understand that. They're not going to necessarily use the vocabulary I just did, but you'll get stuff like, well, the fat cats are going to put who they want in office anyway. I live in the state of West Virginia. I can't really deny that.
Now, Jennifer, let's tie you in here because you take this to a whole other perspective. You look at this corruption and how systems of government operate and have distilled it down to the impact and the victims, particularly people who are essentially not the one percenters, and take a look at, your book is kind of an indictment on the immunity of the wealthy and the price that the poor and those who are less affluent actually must pay. So tell me about how your book got started and why it's very relevant today.
Thanks so much. What a great question. I want to answer it, but I also want to address one thing Sarah said, which I have a chapter in my book called The Contagion of Public Corruption, and I focus on the McDonald case. And it turns out that this is the case with the governor of Virginia. And it does turn out that there are fixes. We could actually just amend the bribery legislation, and Congress hasn't done it. I guess I should be hopeful for that opportunity that it exists, but given the existing political climate, I'm not so sure that will happen. But back to your question, I wrote this book because in 2014, I published a book called Other People's Houses about the decades of deregulation and desupervision that led to the financial meltdown, to the toxic mortgage-backed, securities meltdown. And I remember on the first book reading that I went to on the day of the book launch back in 2014, the very first question someone asked me is, why did no bankers go to jail?
Exactly.
And of course, I didn't have the answer, and that bothered me greatly. And it bothered me so much that I decided to explore the entire field and add it to what I study of white-collar crime and public corruption to get an answer to that question, but also maybe to better put that in context. And as you noted, as part of that study, it's looking at victims. What drove me to look at the financial meltdown were the millions of Americans who lost their homes to foreclosure while the top of society survived and thrived, made money as a bubble expanded, and were rescued when the whole system collapsed. And I came to find out that, of course, that's not just something that happens in the banking sector, it happens elsewhere. For example, big pharma, I mean, one example in the book of many is Purdue Pharma, where the Sackler family became multi-billionaires. And even now, and twice now, that the company itself has been subject to a criminal case. Once pleaded guilty back in 2007, now facing a criminal settlement as part of a bankruptcy. But the family will be unscathed. They'll still keep most of their billions. Sort of maybe be shunned by part of high society, but keep their nice homes and take care of their families. Meanwhile, 200,000 plus people died of prescription opioid overdoses, in part because of the way they aggressively and illegally peddled their drugs. So, I think to me, white collar crime is not a victimless crime, and it leads to great harm in society and makes our problem of inequality even greater.
And speaking of inequality, Mehrsa, I mean, you take this, and am I saying your name correctly, Mehrsa?
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Excellent. So, Mehrsa, you take on this issue of the victims pretty hard, because you look at not just the impact of corruption and government, but really, living in a country where there's so much affluence and wealth, and how that wealth is not distributed, in particular to people of color in this country. I mean, what made you decide to take this on as an issue?
Let me first say that I'm just a huge fan of Sarah and Jennifer's, and I've read both their books, and I'm very excited. I just, ordered the new ones a couple weeks ago, and their work has really inspired my own. But I think the thread here is, look, I mean, if we want markets to work, we have to have a functioning rule of law. People have to be held accountable. Your contracts have to be enforced, and your property has to be protected by law, and crimes have to be prosecuted, when one person does it and when another person does it. And one thing that is a theme, I think, across all of our books is when that breaks down, not only do markets break down, but democracy breaks down and society breaks down. And what I talk about in my book is how actually within the United States, we have never applied those laws equally. We have never applied the property protection, contract enforcement, and the basic rules of equal opportunity before the law to Black men and women. It was legally sanctioned for hundreds of years, through enslavement, through Jim Crow, through legal segregation. The property wasn't protected by law. When they would succeed in businesses, and you had thriving businesses, those would be victims of violence without any recourse in the courts. And so that corruption has been embedded within the American system. It's just a racially embedded system. And I think until we deal head on with that, our markets will keep perpetuating these phenomena like the racial wealth gap. I mean, today, Black homes are worth less than white homes because they are owned by Black people. Capitalism doesn't work to build wealth in Black communities because of this historic legacy of segregation, Jim Crow, and discrimination. And you're never going to fix that using the market tools alone. And so that's the story that I track in the book as to why and how. I'm a banking law scholar. I look at inequality, and I think you actually can't look at the banking system in its entirety. You can't look at things like the Federal Reserve and the U.S. credit market without focusing on this massive inequality that is the whole. It is central to it. It is like the cancer within, and the reason we have the society that we do. And so that's the focus of The Color of Money.
Well, it's also interesting to note, I mean, as you look at the statistics that you talk about in your book, a lot of the wealth for Black families in particular disappeared during the housing crisis. A lot of Black families had a lot of their assets tied up. And now you have situations where there's even a much greater divide. And so how does a country, as we've talked about, that has corruption, that has, where it's difficult to access capital, how do you solve that problem?
Yeah, look, when people are exploited and segregated and discriminated against, when there is a new opportunity for credit and high interest loans, and Jennifer actually talks about this in her first book on the thrift crisis, but you have a subprime crisis blow up and 53% of Black wealth disappears overnight. None of those bankers were prosecuted, as Jennifer's noted, but also those homeowners were never bailed out. right? We chose specifically to bail out the assets on the firm's balance sheets as opposed to doing it with homeowners. So that's not exactly corruption because it's illegal, but it is, the game being rigged. And I think, when you do that often enough, and we have done that over the last several decades, people lose trust in the system. And so I don't think, like as Sarah said, it's not quite like Afghanistan. I'm a Middle Easterner, so I can attest to rule of law being broken down much more in those areas. But we are on that slide here, as Sarah so well articulated, and part of that is the disparate treatment of certain corporations and very moneyed people versus average people. And you saw this during the financial crisis. You saw this with the PPP, the CARES Act. All of those went differentially to different people, and people lose trust. And you have conspiracy theories. When you have, Tuskegee experiments, when you have COINTELPRO, is it any wonder that people, don't trust the government, right? And I don't condone that. I think that is, some of these things are just crazy wackadoodle, but the FBI has also hidden a bunch of things that it's done to our own citizens.
So Sarah, you talk about in your book the premise of this idea that, of course, history is going to repeat itself, right? We keep making the same mistakes over and over again. What are you seeing right now where you're just like, you know what, we're doing it again?
So before I answer, I was just going to break in and say, do you mind if I just come back on a couple of things that Jennifer and Mehrsa said?
Go right ahead.
So I think another way that we can tie ourselves together here is, Jennifer, and I know you put much more detailed work in this, but when you ask why did no bankers get prosecuted, there's one element of the answer which gets at something I really want to emphasize. The Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, had previously worked as a defense attorney representing big banks. And then he goes in to become the Attorney General. And so, golly gee, surprise, he didn't, prosecute any of his former clients. And this is how the integrated networks that I was talking about function. We have this expression revolving door in the United States. I think that's a little bit misleading because it suggests it's one individual like Holder who, let's say, was in the private sector and then he pushes the door through to the public sector and then he comes back, as though the sectors are divided and it's an isolated individual who pushes the door. The way a lot of this happens is that the network is integrated fully across public and private sectors. And the role of the people in government is not so much, so corruption isn't really about do they fill their own pockets when they're in government. It's really that they are bending and twisting the rules and mechanisms and agencies of government to serve their network rather than the public interest. And so when you have things like a racially embedded, how did you put it, Mehrsa? A racially embedded...
A credit system?
What did you say?
I think I said, the credit system, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But that's part of what I'm talking about. And what's so, I want to say, effective about doing what you were describing is, number one, it's a great revenue stream. You can extract enormous amounts of money from the least privileged people in our society. And the second benefit you get is that you divide up the potential coalition of sort of egalitarian victims of this system who otherwise might be able to join forces to rein these guys in. And instead, by pitting one race against the other, you've separated out the coalition. And then back to who gets bailed out, it's as you said, Jennifer, 2008, but it's happening today, and it's not just the PPP. It's really the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is channeling $6 trillion into the pockets, basically, of corporations that took on too much debt. And they took on too much debt in order to overpay their shareholders and other officers. And it is perfectly within the Federal Reserve's discretion to, offer cities and states loans at 0% interest. But they're not doing that. They're giving the good rates to corporations. Now, let me just walk you through the network briefly, and then I'll shut up. So the way the Federal Reserve is doing this is the Federal Reserve doesn't apparently know how to buy bonds, so it has to contract a private company to buy bonds. But the Board of Governors doesn't contract that company. It tells the New York Fed to do this work. The New York Fed doesn't contract that company. Instead, the New York Fed creates a shell company domiciled in Delaware, which is one of the most famous secrecy jurisdictions in the world. That shell company, which is now a private company, therefore we the people don't have access to any of the information about how our $6 trillion is getting spent. That private shell company then contracts BlackRock, a gigantic money manager, on a no-bid contract to do all of this buying under a contract that's got terrific terms. And oh, by the way, if you look at BlackRock's employee roles, you'll see dozens of former employees of the Federal Reserve and Treasury. That's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of how this type of corruption, network systemic corruption, produces the outcomes that both Jennifer and Mehrsa are talking about. Sorry, I didn't answer your question on history, but I can do that later once it's my turn again, because that's important too.
No, this is good. And actually, based off of that question, I feel like for people who may not be as steeped into baking and have the understanding of all you ladies on this panel or all you people and folks on the panel that, before everybody knows like the subprime crisis but they don't know what today that looks like. What is the subprime crisis today that you all see that we're going to be talking about 1 year or 2 years from now?
If I could jump in.
Yeah,
sorry.
Jennifer, yeah.
I want to jump in and say two things. We have this habit now, Kimbriell, of sort of waiting to answer your question. And then I want to clarify that one banker actually did go to jail, not a super high level, but one bank executive did. And it shouldn't surprise us that, that the person who was chosen was not someone that anyone had heard of until there was a piece Jesse Eisinger wrote for the New York Times. And it turns out it was a man with an Egyptian name, because a Middle Eastern name. He was born in Egypt. His name is Kareem Sarageldin. He was raised in Michigan, and he was working out of London. And he was the only executive in the U.S. who went to prison. So some of the racial inequality that I discuss in terms of who gets to use white-collar crime to advance and who doesn't in our society can be seen there. Kimbriell, in terms of your question of now, I mean, to me, it is tied into both what Mehrsa and Sarah said about our loss of faith in the rule of law and our loss of faith in private and government institutions. And Mehrsa was kind of hinting at this when she was talking about, there's some wackadoodle theories out there, right? There are people who are completely anti-vaxxers, despite the fact of all the evidence that the childhood vaccines do not cause autism and so on. But it's hard to really blame people for latching on to these kinds of conspiracy theories when we see big pharma do bad things and get away with it. And this is what's so frightening during something like the coronavirus pandemic, because we now are going to need people to believe in and accept and get a vaccine if we want to get a handle on this. And so I think, to me, what we're going to see is, and I do believe there's a link here between the rise and election of Donald Trump and our loss of our inability to hold people accountable. So that makes people think maybe all government is corrupt because our government didn't hold the bankers accountable, but also the fact that someone like Donald Trump, if he had actually been held accountable for his many misdeeds and his actions that appear to be criminal, if that had happened, I believe he would have served time in federal prison and not the Oval Office. But his behavior, even what we see today, refusing to accept the outcome of an election where he's clearly lost, this kind of I will do what I want regardless of the law, try to make me attitude, all about power and disregard for norms. He didn't invent that. He took advantage. He was kind of extruded from a system that rewards people who do that. And so I think if we look back on this period, if we actually get beyond it, we're going to see it is kind of a wide scale corruption if we can't get a handle on it soon.
Well, I mean, we have folks like you all who are going to be writing books about this and ongoingly, but we see that the media has taken a hit in terms of, the last 4 years of bruising from the White House. And, a lot of publications have folded. The number of reporters has declined, but this work still remains. And as you've mentioned, there's potentially even more corruption. We're repeating the history of the past. And so, with that in mind, and also knowing what you just talked about, that people have just such a distrust in the government and the system right now, where is this accountability going to come from? And does the public still have faith that there will be some changes under, a President Biden administration?
I mean, I think the accountability has to come at the ballot box at this point too. I mean, I think yes, the laws and enforcing laws equally to everyone, and like Jennifer said, is Donald Trump can get away with it, but it is a sense of white men in power in this country have been able to get away with more, and the person that does become a scapegoat usually when you have this massive crisis and then you see someone go to jail, it's someone lower on the chain of sort of racial gender hierarchy. I do think that our democracy is broken in a way that was built in with bugs, right? The Electoral College, the way that the Senate works, the fact that you have 4 million more people voting for Joe Biden than Donald Trump, and it came down to really such narrow margins in these states. I mean, we have a slaveholders constitution. As of today, even Alexander Hamilton apparently, was a holder of slaves, according to the New York Times. And he was the sort of like the one of the heroes of the North's sort of push against the Southern slaveholders. But when you have the Electoral College, you have the way that the Senates are allocated, and I think a lot of people do feel like their vote doesn't matter. And even when they do vote, you have very motivated interests with lots of money. And I talked about money in politics, but Citizens United having blown open the door for just unlimited corporate spending, what Jane Myers called dark money, but even just light money out there that is just the lobbying money that is swashing through Washington. And it is no wonder that people just feel like, well, why would I vote? Why do I even participate in democracy? So I think the way that the accountability goes, and if we're going to do it going forward, is you have to make people's lives actually better. You have to show them that the government is working for them. And I don't begin to imagine that this is going to be easy, given that Mitch McConnell, is running the Senate. And that is not to be, an understatement. That is not Mitch McConnell's main goal, is to, provide stimulus funds or make people's lives like physically, materially better. The Supreme Court, I think you have these few issues that get packed into the court. And so yes, Amy Coney Barrett is selected because she's anti-abortion, and a lot of people care about that. But she's going to make a series of decisions for the next 40 years that are pro-corporation and against people. That is the record that she has, and so that also leads into that distrust.
Can I field the history question quickly?
Absolutely.
So when I discovered that the United States really did fit the pattern that I had been, kind of seeing and elaborating as I looked at, a dozen developing world countries, which was already tough to take. I mean, I sort of found what I expected to find, but it was still a blow to the gut. Then I really had to say, well, was there another time in history when the politics and economy, not just of the United States, but of other countries, because this is not a phenomenon, it's not just us, as I keep on saying today. Was there another period? And I came upon, I'm calling it the Gilded Age, but it's really longer than technically the Gilded Age, from approximately 1870 to approximately 1935. And I was stunned at how similar the situation was in terms, again, of these interwoven networks, including out and out criminals, frankly, that really were able to bend the instruments of power, including, and this is relevant to the whole conversation, in particular, the justice sector. Every kleptocracy that I've looked at everywhere around the world, it has to capture the justice sector because it has to be able to mete out punishment and promise impunity. It has to be able to do both. And in the rare cases where a kleptocratic system can't capture the justice sector, it works around it. Egypt is a good example of that. And so basically, the current president of Egypt just moved cases over to the military courts. He changed the jurisdiction of civilian courts, and he can control the military courts. So all of those things were similar. The 14th Amendment, which is about equal protection under the law for freed, enslaved people, by 1902, there was a study. It had been used half a dozen times with respect to freed former enslaved people. They had lost every single time. It had been used dozens and dozens and dozens of times on behalf of corporations, and they had usually won. That's called bending, an instrument of state, obviously manifestly not the intent of that amendment. And what I found around the world, I also saw in this period that I'm talking about. First of all, the result was repeated financial meltdowns, 1873, 1882, 1896, blah, 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 just like us. Savingsandloan.com, the mid-1990s, and then, 2008. So I'm seeing that parallel. And then I'm seeing a kind of extremism, this is going to be, it's going to be a little challenging what I'm about to say, but there was a bombing on Wall Street in 1920. It was a shocking act of terrorism committed by what were called anarchists. And it was meant explicitly to draw attention precisely to this corrupt system. And of course, it didn't. The result was a huge Red Scare, and everyone decided that anarchists were the worst threat to, the United States. I was struck by the parallel with 9/11. 9/11, if you read Al-Qaeda, and I am not trying to, excuse these attacks, but if you read what Al-Qaeda wrote about it, it's very similar. The indictment of this system and its support for kleptocracy in Saudi Arabia is very explicit in their documents. And similarly, instead of drawing our attention to the issues that they were raising, it made us decide that the existential threat to the United States was terrorists. And I myself, at the time, I go running off to Afghanistan and spend a decade there because I thought the story was about violent political Islam, when in fact, the real story was right there on Wall Street. And in both cases, there was a huge economic meltdown within less than a dozen years of the terrorist attacks in 1929 and 2008. And so I am afraid that we are kind of on the same path as we were in that period. And the other thing that makes me concerned is that the only thing I can see that really bumped us out of that path before was a succession of global calamities. 2 world wars, 2 genocides, use of the nuclear bomb, a pandemic that dwarfed this one, and a global economic meltdown. And so my sense of urgency in terms of holding people accountable It's not about a nicer or more equitable system. This is about the survival of our society. So I actually think I would get a little bit harder hitting about how to hold people accountable. I think there has to be consequences. And so that means we've been talking about defunding or reimagining street crime police. I'm like, hey, while we're reimagining those police, let's reimagine the corporate crime and corruption police. Let's give them way more resources. Let's give them way more enforcement powers. Let's make it sexy to be on that beat, you know? But just lopping off a few heads of the Hydra, even if we could do that, is not going to keep them from, more sprouting. So then you need very specific hard edge reforms in terms of, revolving door, conflict of interest, nepotism, recusal. All of those need to be expanded. Bribery, gifts, statutes like that, honest services, wire fraud. And then I think there really has to be popular mobilization. And that means mass mobilization. It means demanding an ethics pledge from let's all, hold the new incoming administration, no matter what our political party, let's hold it up to its own highest standards. If they start putting the same Wall Street insiders into Treasury and the Fed, we have to call them on it. And I just, yeah, so you get the idea. Sorry.
I get the idea, but it also makes me think about, Jennifer, I'm going to tee this up to you. Sarah's making some predictions here in terms of what people should watch out for, what action should happen based off of your wisdom. What do you think?
So, there's a lot of parallels, I would say. I have something, I'm this kind of person who, through these cycles of disasters, somehow remain with a smile on my face. And I don't know why that is. But I think that I always remain optimistic, because when I look at the similar history she's looking at, I do see cycles of crime waves, corporate and white-collar crime waves and crackdowns. And I agree that we really do need a crackdown, and that starts with the right mindset and putting our resources there. So I have this thing in the introduction and then a whole chapter on 6 fixes. And I don't want to go through each of them, but some of them, like Sarah mentioned, substantively, some of the tools have to change in terms of updating the bribery.
Or I can just sit up.
Gratuity laws. And also, in addition to updating the bribery and gratuity laws, we need to deal with, as she mentioned, the honest services fraud statute. This has to do with the Bridgegate case. You might remember recently the folks who were involved in deliberately retaliating against someone who wasn't supporting Governor Chris Christie. Their convictions were overturned. And so those tools need to be tightened. More money, dedicated staff at the Department of Justice. But I also, there's a whole bunch of other ways to empower whistleblowers under our federal statutes. But I want to touch also on this idea of funding and empowering journalists. And we need to do more to make sure that independent journalists can keep doing shining the light on corruption and on illegality. But bottom line is, I think we have, I used to be a huge fan, I guess you can call it that, of Brandeis, and this idea that sunlight was the best disinfectant. Electric light, is said to be a wonderful policeman, his quote. But I've actually now think that it's Frederick Douglass. I think we can see what's right in front of us, and power concedes nothing without a demand. And so we actually have to demand this. And I agree. So far, I've seen some good names be put forward for who Biden, a few good names. I'm not saying the whole list that I saw that to be advisors to him, possibly in the cabinet. And I think personnel is policy. And there's a lot that just a few individuals who don't want to, go along to get along, but who actually have a mission of cracking down and dealing with what has gone on over the past decade. If you put them in positions of power, things will change. And I can give you a list of people and it would make a huge difference. But if we don't want to make any changes, then things will get much worse.
Well, in a moment, I'm going to ask all three of you to read just a graph from your book. But in advance of that, I'm going to ask you, Mehrsa, one last question before I do that. You know, with this historic election, I mean, people just voted in droves. And the story after story that you saw, in addition to the Latino vote, were about Black voters, particularly about Stacey Abrams and the mobilization of voters within Georgia. But a lot of what fuels that is also the economy and the wealth disparities that you talked about. But, you know, based off of your knowledge and your wisdom, you know, can a Biden administration start to turn things around for disparities that have been so systemic?
Yeah, let's be clear here. The Black community delivered Biden those crucial states. The Black Latino community, you know, there were some exit polls that were showing these numbers, but for Atlanta, Philadelphia, Detroit coming out, you know, I mean, the highest voter turnout in a century, you know, and you have these real, you know, yes, it's broken the Electoral College, but you had a mandate. You had a summer of racial unrest. You had, you know, the George Floyd shooting and many, the Breonna Taylor and many since then, you know, those two kind of just put the country on fire. And a lot of people, a lot of Americans came out on the streets. It was, you know, and saying we are not Black, but you cannot do this to our Black brothers and sisters. And so I think that this is the moment. I think we are at another pivotal moment, you know, going back to Frederick Douglass, as Jennifer said, Reconstruction, you know, post-civil rights era. And, you know, each moment you're going to have a jostling of power. I do see Trump as one of the last gasps of this like white male misogynist supremacy, really trying to hold on to power. And we'll see how that goes. But I think the people came out and really went, you know, against him. You know, I don't know. I wouldn't say that, you know, that they chose like exactly the agenda going forward, but I think there's this general dissatisfaction. And I think that this is President-elect Biden and, you know, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris's chance to really do racial equity in a way that has not been done in America in a meaningful way. So I think that this is it. I don't think we get a lot of chances to gain the trust of those communities if we blow it this time.
And Mehrsa, let me just ask you real quick, based off of that and your history in banking, what is something that the president should do to help remedy that?
Reparations, a reparations commission. You know, I think just study it. You know, look at what's been extracted, what has been taken, and you know, you look at, you know, and Sarah's work across countries. You know, you usually when a country, you know, destroys another people, not usually, but sometimes you pay reparations. You know, the Nazis, you're never going to make, you know, the Jewish community right. You're never going to make up for the Holocaust, but you can pay damages to some of that destruction that was wrought. It's not going to make Black Americans whole. It never made the Jewish Americans whole. But you know, there are remedies to make, and I think that heals our nation in a way to get rid of these long-standing tensions and deep-rooted problems. Is to, you know, in that way, going back to Brandeis, as Jennifer brought him up, maybe sunlight, not as a policy, but sunlight is a good healing mechanism. Like, bring it out, let's study it, let's lay it out there. What did we do? How did we justify racism in this country to uphold this economy of slavery, of Jim Crow, of segregation, and how much wealth was extracted from Black men and women? Their bodies were traded and sold, and families were torn apart. And then we spent 100 years blaming them for it, for their own, you know, inequalities. And so, you know, let's just lay it out and deal with it.
All right. On that note, Sarah, I'm going to start with you with a selection from your book.
Okay, I think I marked it. What did I say? Yeah, this is early on in the book, and I kind of go through some of the obvious litany of what we've seen in the Trump administration just briefly, and then I say, Startling and outrageous though these excesses may seem, however, they are not total aberrations. And that's, Jennifer already said that. The United States has seen episodes of corruption before, and the systemic version, unique to this moment, has been more than 30 years in the making, abetted by political leaders of all persuasions and the wealthy who have directly and indirectly benefited. Ordinary Americans, the 90%, have been noticing, and they are rightly furious. Corruption to the degree and intensity we're now witnessing is an affront. It also brings down economies, ignites wars, exterminates peoples and species, and tears irrevocable scars across the face of the earth. It's an existential threat, not just to the democratic principles we claim to revere, but to the very survival of our society. A sentence about, sometimes it just seems so overwhelming, we go limp. We throw our energy into something else. But if the other side has the money, we have the numbers. That's a potent force. The task is to bring it fully to bear.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Jennifer?
So I'm reading just one paragraph here from the preface, a subsection that has this subheading, implicit immunity. We have a double standard in the American criminal justice system that reflects and perpetuates inequality. Cutting legal corners is a tool for advancement only available to the already affluent. The wealthy not only increase their power by evading punishment, but also benefit from a criminal justice system that incarcerates those with lower social status who also attempt to use crime to get ahead. Selling loose cigarettes on a New York City sidewalk can lead to a chokehold arrest and death. Eric Garner, a middle-aged Black man, was surrounded by police officers, tackled, and suffocated for what was just a small-time tax dodge. Garner was selling cigarettes purchased cheaper by the pack out of state and selling them one by one to passers-by. Tax evasion. Depriving New York State and city of nearly $5.85 per pack. The Department of Justice decided not to prosecute the police officer who killed Garner. The reasoning? The powers that be believed he had not used excessive force under the circumstances. Racism is baked into that conclusion. Can you imagine cops circling, tackling, and choking a white woman who was poised to drop her fraudulent tax return in a city mailbox? How would that not be considered excessive force?
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. Mehrsa?
So I'm just going to read the introduction, but I do want to say that my book was written and completed and published well before any of this stuff, so I would have given it more depth, but this is the introduction. Unfortunately, it is more true now than it was before, really unfortunately. It says, all too often, when there's mass unemployment in the Black community, it is referred to as a social problem. And when there's mass unemployment in the white community, it is referred to as a depression, said Martin Luther King in 1968. But he said there is no basic difference. The fact is that the Negro faces a literal depression all over the U.S. End quote. Today, across every socioeconomic level, Blacks have significantly less wealth than whites. Over a third of Black families have either negative wealth or no assets at all. The 2008 financial crisis devoured more than half the wealth of the Black community, proving once again the old adage that when Wall Street catches a cold, Harlem gets pneumonia. To the extent that the media and politicians focus on the racial divide, it is through its most urgent and salient features, such as police shootings, burning cities, white supremacists, crime, and violence. Underneath it all is a deep and growing financial fault line between Black and white. Though hard to detect, it is nonetheless the defining feature of America's racial divide because it is intimately linked to so many of the other problems. the wealth gap is where historic injustice breeds present suffering.
Excellent. Thank you. And at this point in our conversation, we're going to move on to questions from that were collected ahead of time. And based off of the answer that you just gave, Mehrsa, I'm going to tee up this question. And I believe you've answered it with reparations, but I'm also interested in hearing if you have another answer, if others on the panel would like to answer this question from Ethan. And so he asks, what do you think the country can and should do moving forward to decrease the racial wealth gap? I'll open that question.
So my answer is reparations. The root of it is housing segregation, and that all of that, leads to credit segregation and all of the sort of political rights that derive from that, the over-policing of Black neighborhoods, the, under-resourced Black schools, and all of that really has to do with the way that we never fix those segregation patterns. So how do you fix segregation? You can tackle it directly and, through housing programs that really get people the wealth that they were deprived over the last 100 years, or you can hit it through reparations and give people money so that they can move to wherever they want to and buy equity. So I have, lots of those ideas laid out in the book.
I think another thing sorry. Is that okay? I think another thing to add is free higher education for anyone who's admitted to public university. In my lifetime, when I was a very small child, you could go to a California state university for free, really. And I think that should be the same thing. And it should be, from preschool all the way through 4 years of higher education should be fully free and accessible, really to everybody.
Let's throw healthcare in there. Basic public services ought to be rights guaranteed by the public sector.
So pretty much housing, education, and healthcare.
Why not?
Big three.
This is what middle-class families provide for their children. So why not? Everyone should.
The next question I have is from Maria Andrea, I believe. And she asks, when are we going to switch from focusing on indicators of economic growth to focusing on indicators of economic sustainability as a measure of how well the economy is doing?
That is such a great question. And it's economic growth. It's growth in general. Let's just say, unlimited growth on a finite body. I thought that was cancer, and I thought it's fatal. Why do we think that growth of the economy, of corporations, of our personal paychecks, of our populations is a good? It's become almost synonymous for good. So I can't answer the question when, but keep asking. Thanks for asking, and keep on asking, and let's all keep asking.
And, I will insert here that we have this very Western-centric view of the history of the universe, as though history started, when the British Empire started discovering lands. But there were people, ancient cultures that weren't based in growth. They were based in harmony and sustainability. And there were clearly, warlike cultures as well. But we are talking about one way of living that was quite dominant in the evolutionary sense. It took
like 150,000 years, exactly. Yeah.
But we know we as a species lived, in a way that we weren't destroying every other species. We weren't changing the environment of the earth, and so some of that wisdom, if we don't destroy it, still exists. And I do think we absolutely have to limit growth, measure it differently. Maybe growth is how many children can we get fed next year? And that'll be our GDP. Like if we can go from, 50% of children in the world to 100% have all their meals and all their healthcare, that's our, our GDP targets, and maybe it's not the stock market, because the stock market is like our, golden calf. And we're, even during the coronavirus, we're literally sacrificing human lives to the stock market. And at what point do we say, well, does the market serve us, or do we serve the market? Not to take the religious analogy, but if we're sacrificing humans, what is this market God, right? And why don't we worship something else?
You know, Robert Kennedy has this incredible speech in 1968 about at the time it was called GNP. It's absolutely beautiful. I have it in On Corruption in America, but you can, Google it and find it. And it's making all of these points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mehrsa, I really like that you mentioned the golden calf, because now I'm thinking, not to get too religious, but to be more like a lawyer, just thinking about the trade-off between worshiping gold, worshiping wealth, and having the rule of law, which I guess the Ten Commandments would embody. And I'm saying this in a non-religious sense, but just thinking of this from a legal perspective.
They're myths for a reason. We were kind of taught, through these religious traditions, and obviously that one is one that a lot of religions were based on, and there's a reason to say, like, don't worship this market, maybe worship laws, and you don't have to put the Judeo-Christian God in there, but you really do need to balance. And you can even go back to that, before that moment, and look at the cultures that celebrated like trees and life, because really, like, why not worship trees? Like they're what's keeping us alive at this point. I'm not saying worship as a religious worship, but why not attend to their needs in the same way that we attend to the stock market's needs?
And this circles back to one of the first things you said tonight, Mehrsa, which was, if the one thread through all of our work was that if you want to have functioning markets, you also need to have boundaries on them, because to some degree, you're not no one here is suggesting we should suddenly like all start making our own clothes and computers and medicines. We're actually kind of saying the opposite, but that we want to have the right balance where markets are controlled and regulated by people, so they create and sustain the kind of life and health and education and wealth that would be a kind of shared prosperity, I think is what I hear us saying, but it's kind of gone off the rails where it sort of stands on its own as its own sort of measure without thinking about what it's actually fueling.
I'd just like to come back to the question in particular. There was a group of people, and I think it may be Piketty, the French economist, who wrote Capital in the 21st Century. I think his group, but I'm not positive that it's them, but I know it's at least some of them are French, actually did sit down and work on what could a different measure than GDP be. And so I've forgotten the name of the person who asked that question, but hunt around a little bit on again, the internet if you can, because some interesting work has been done in that regard. And since it has been, then maybe it's time for us to start demanding it. And that means writing into, whatever our news source is and say, would you stop telling me about GDP? I'm not interested. Would you please start citing these numbers instead, and put some public pressure on this?
Just a note of positivity. Yeah, so just a note of positivity. Heather Boucher in America, who runs Equitable Growth, has written a book about measuring GDP in different ways. And she is said to be Biden's economic advisor. So, we really could be thinking along those lines in the next administration.
Excellent. A question from Jonathan that we really didn't get into too much tonight, but it's an interesting one. What do you think the chances are of breaking up big tech?
I think the answer to that question depends on what happens in Georgia in early January. And in other words, I think right when I got out of law school, I worked on one of my clients. One of the matters I worked on I was an antitrust lawyer, and I dealt with the sort of fallout of the breakup of AT&T. So, it's possible to take a large company and decide if it's anti-competitive or engaging in monopoly behavior to split it up. It's just a question, again, it's a question of political will, but I don't think there's a chance if there's not a Democratic majority in the Senate. And then, of course, they would need to also get rid of the filibuster. But, I think we'll know more in early January.
So 2 things on that. One is, first of all, read Zephyr Teachout's recent book, Break 'em Up. And she actually suggests that there is a lot more that can be done without legislation. She thinks that a lot of these companies could be broken up without legislation. It's an enforcement issue. The question is political will. But secondly, I would like to put a caveat on the Senate thing. Even with Georgia, it's 50-50. And effectively, I mean, how are you going to then repeal the filibuster if you're 50-50? Because you're going to need to have a cloturable. You're going to need, basically at this point, every single important bill has to pass the Senate by 60. The Senate is no longer a majority ruled institution. And so I don't even know why there's so much excitement about Georgia. I mean, at the best, sorry, not to have my position showing or anything like that. I mean, the most that it could achieve would be some committee chairmen and women.
Well, you can get rid of the filibuster if you have the vice president's vote.
With 51, why don't they then threaten?
I believe that the Senate. I don't know the intricacies of the rules, but I believe changing Senate rules doesn't require. I don't know that they need. I don't need that they need to get over cloture for that, but I might be wrong. But you make an excellent point, which was AT&T was broken up by the Department of Justice, not by legislation, Sarah. So great point.
Well, unfortunately, we're actually out of time. But this has been a wonderful conversation today with Mehrsa Baradaran, Sarah Chayes, and Jennifer Taub. I thank you all tremendously for this discussion. You've teed up a lot of great ideas and suggestions, and perhaps somebody from the administration is listening. And if we have this conversation 1 year from today, we'll see some of these things in place. Who knows? Thank you also for everyone else out there who is tuned in on the conversation today. And finally, another reminder to support our book selling partner pages with your book purchases and receive a signed book plays. For Kimbriell Kelly at the LA Times, thanks for everyone being here today.
Thank you. And again, thanks to the audience too, absolutely.
Thank you.